My guest at this time is Stephen Moore, economic advisor to President Trump. He's also affiliated with the Heritage Foundation and FreedomWorks, and he is co-author of the new book, Trumponomics, Inside the America First Plan to Revive Our Economy. We want to take a look at the year in economics and the year to come. And, Steve, it's always great to have you with us. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Greg. Merry Christmas. Thanks for having me.
Merry Christmas to you, sir. It's been a year since the tax cut plan was passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. Since then, we've seen stronger GDP numbers and unemployment numbers that are near a 50-year low. But it's been a rough couple of months on Wall Street. And just this week, we saw a couple of economic surveys, including some comments by Alan Greenspan that suggest some folks are a little bit worried about a recession next year. So let's take these one at a time. First of all, what do you see as the impact so far of the tax reform bill?
Oh, well, the tax reform has been, spectacular success with, amazing amount of money coming into the United States and factories being built. We're in the biggest construction and manufacturing boom in 50 years in this country right now. You see that we have the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. Wages are rising. It's hard to point to any single thing that hasn't worked with the tax cut. It's been, a lot of factories are moving back to the United States, the kind of businesses that were moving, their factories to Michigan, to places like Mexico and China are moving factories back to our country. So it's been very solid. By the way, 2018, we collected more federal tax revenues into the federal treasury than at any time ever in American history. So the fact that the budget deficit up has nothing to do with the tax cut because we have more tax revenues. It's a spending problem. But no, I think President Trump, that's the crown jewel of his agenda so far.
So let's take a look at the longer impact because one of the nice things for businesses is certainty. And the rate is locked in. It went from 35 down to 21%. So you talked about the benefits we've seen in the first 12 months. What are we going to see in the coming years as a result of them knowing that these rates are probably not going anywhere?
Well, that's a great question because a lot of liberals are saying, well, this is just a sugar effect and a sugar high and that, that we're going to crash down from this in 2019. I don't see it. For one thing, the tax cuts don't go away for another 5 or 6 years. And we should make them permanent, by the way, because they've been such a phenomenal success. But no, I think that you mentioned the corporate rate reduction from 35 to 21%. Small businesses saw their tax rate go from 40 to 30. We saw a repatriation tax cut, so businesses with investment money abroad can bring it back to the United States and build businesses here and pay a 10 to 12% tax rate for that. And by the way, the average family, we did a study at the Heritage Foundation, found the average family is saving $2,000 to $2,500 a year on their taxes thanks to this tax cut.
So you don't see that as crumbs, I guess, as Nancy Pelosi famously called it.
That's a great point. Nancy Pelosi sees it as crumbs, but the average American, if you're making $60,000 a year and you get $2,500 a year more in your paycheck each year, that's a very positive thing.
Steve, you mentioned that you believe that the deficits we're seeing are a spending problem, not a revenue problem. I know from talking to outgoing Congressman Dave Brad and others that the way this tax reform bill was structured is that 3% growth pays for the cuts. Anything more than that is a net positive. And obviously with the GDP we've seen, at least in the last couple of quarters, the revenues are in the right direction here. So what's sustainable in the long haul over the next 10 years?
You mean for growth, or
for growth? In order to prove your point that in fact these will pay for themselves and then some.
Yeah. So our main point wasn't that whether the tax cuts would pay for themselves. It was that they would get Americans back to work and put us on a stronger growth path, and that's happened. By the way, the Congressional Budget Office has already increased its estimate for the growth rate over the next 10 years by $6 trillion since we passed the tax cut. So, the federal government gets, 20% of that. So that's going to be $1.5 trillion right there. But no, the whole premise of Trumponomics, this is in our book that I wrote with Art Laffer, is that you've got to grow the economy faster if you want to solve these problems of the debt, the deficit, income inequality, poverty, the problems in the inner city. You've got to get growth up. And that's happened. When Trump was elected, the economic growth rate was 1.5% for the year 2018. We've got a couple more weeks left, but the preliminary numbers show a growth rate of about 3.2 to 3.3%. That's a big difference. It means Trump has doubled the economic growth rate in just 2 years in office.
What are the critical factors in maintaining and even accelerating our growth besides the tax policies we've talked about?
Well, you mentioned this at the outset of this interview that we've got a massive problem now on our hands, which is the Federal Reserve is actually just crushing the economy and sucking dollars out of the economy at a time when we need the Fed to be putting more money into the economy. There's great demand for dollars now. We have the fastest growing economy in the world, so everyone wants to get a hold of dollars, and the Fed made a tragic mistake on December 19th when they raised interest rates. They should be cutting interest rates, not raising them. We are in a deflationary spiral right now. Look at what's happened with oil prices. Look what's happening to the prices of wheat and cotton and soybeans and copper. It's a very, very dangerous situation. And, for the first time in a long time, we have a Federal Reserve which is really out of control, anti-growth. I'm really worried about that, Greg. And, we've seen the stock market fall, by something like 1,000 points since the Fed made its tragic decision. But, on the other fronts, the things that Trump has control over, the regulations, we've reduced regulations by over 40% since Trump came into office, and that's liberated companies to expand their operations here. The energy policies by promoting American oil and gas and coal. I don't know if you saw the news, Greg, a couple of weeks ago. For the first time in 50 years, America is now producing more oil and gas than we're consuming, which means
right.
We're now a net exporter. I mean, whoever would have ever thought 10 years ago that was possible, but it is the reality today because of the shale oil and gas revolution. So the things that Trump has had control over, he's moved the dials in a pro-growth direction, and I believe we can stay on this 3 to 4% growth path, for 3, 4, 5, 6 years if the Fed will accommodate that by allowing, the prices to be stable, not falling.
What are we looking at if the Fed does not accommodate?
Well, it could be Trump sledding. I mean, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but it is true that in the 1930s when we had the Great Depression, it was in no small part because the Fed created a deflationary monetary policy. You and I are old enough to remember the 1970s when we had a very inflationary policy. You remember when inflation hit 15%. What you want in your monetary policy is stable prices. And my point to you, Greg, and your listeners is deflation can be as damaging to the economy as inflation. And so we need to fire the Fed. I mean, the Fed, we should just have a price rule that keeps the dollar and prices of goods and services stable and not have the Fed try to micromanage our economy because they're not oracles, obviously. Look what they've done to the economy just in the last couple of months.
We're talking with Stephen Moore. The book is Trumponomics, Inside the America First Plan to Revive Our Economy, which he wrote alongside his friend and fellow economist, Art Laffer. And, Steve, you mentioned a moment ago that the things that President Trump has dealt with directly has led us in the right direction. The one area where you might get some pushback on that, even from your fellow supply-siders, is on tariffs. I know that's an issue that you
Yes.
generally disagree with him on. You're more of a free trader than he is. So what's the impact of that? We obviously hear a lot in the press about uncertainty created by the potential for some trade wars here, but what's the reality?
Well, the reality is that, obviously tariffs are taxes on American consumers, so they do harm the American economy. I think the president made a mistake on his steel and auto tariffs. I think those are hurting the economy more than they're helping them. But the big deal, the thing that has the big overarch over the economy right now is the China trade war that we're in. And let's call it what it is. It is a trade war that we're in with China. They are engaged in incredibly abusive behavior in China. We learned last week that they have been hacking into American companies' databases. They're cheating, they're stealing, they're lying. We need to be very cognizant of this misbehavior, and Trump has called them out on this, which is a fantastic thing. And so what I would say to you is I think Trump is going to win this trade war. I think we're going to get trade concessions from China, and when that happens, I think you're going to see the market just burst with joy, and you're going to see a huge increase in asset prices. And so this is the right fight. We can't continue with this relationship with China, with their stealing $300 billion a year from us. If I'm right, that China capitulates and makes concessions and Trump gets a victory here, it will actually be a victory for free trade, and it will be a big victory for the American economy.
Steve, last question. I want to get back to your book here, Trumponomics, and couch it in current political terms, as you well know, the 2020 cycle has pretty much already started. We're going to get some exploratory committee announcements here pretty quickly in a pretty crowded Democratic field. And whoever the Democratic nominee is likely to have a pretty significant contrast in their economic outlook to President Trump. So
I think that's a pretty fair bet.
So how would you distill, and I guess it depends exactly on who the nominee is, but for the most part, when you look at what not only folks like Bernie Sanders want, but Joe Biden and some of these other likely top-tier candidates would be pushing compared to what President Trump is doing and would plan to do for another 4 years?
Well, this will be, we say this a lot, but this is a monumentally important election because it's a question of whether we're going to continue with Trump's, pro-growth economic policies that have so turned around our economy and created this boom, or whether we move back to the kind of policies we had under Obama where the economy, was in this really slow growth era. Look, my opinion on this is very simple. If the economy continues to do as well as it has under Trump's first 2 years in office, he's going to win a 40-state, reelection landslide like Reagan did in 1984. But if the economy goes south on him and we can't get this trade deal done and things, start to go south, then you Democrats are going to be very competitive. So that's why this trade war is so important. Why it's so important that we make these tax cuts permanent to keep the economy on the 3 to 4% growth path. And since it's right before Christmas, I'm going to say, really optimistically, I think that's going to happen. I think this slide in the stock market is temporary, and I think we're going to get back onto the, the very high growth path that we were on in the first half of 2018 and in 2017.
Quick follow-up, because the Democrats would do what?
Well, they want Medicare for all, which is a $3 trillion a year new entitlement plan. They want to rescind and repeal the tax cuts, which would be very damaging for the economy. They want to have socialized medicine for the country. I mean, you go down the line and almost all of it. They want to re-regulate. They want gas taxes and increase. They want a radical green agenda to fight climate change. Those are very, very negative things for the economy. I think it would do severe damage.
Steve, we'll certainly be watching. I know you will as well, and hopefully we'll get to talk again many times in the new year. Stephen Moore is an economic advisor to President Trump. He's also with the Heritage Foundation and FreedomWorks, and he's the co-author, along with fellow economist Art Laffer, of the new book, Trumponomics, Inside the America First Plan to Revive Our Economy. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.